Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming. Hello, Oslo. There are more of you than I ever thought there would be. It's great. So I am going to kind of introduce the book and talk a little bit about my journey. But before I do, I just had a question so I can take stock of my audience. So if you don't mind, close your eyes for a moment so we can do this in complete privacy. And if you have had a psychedelic experience, please raise your hand. Oh. Okay, put your hands down. Now you can open your eyes. The overwhelming majority. I have a sophisticated audience here. That's very good to know. So what I want to talk about a little bit is I have been on a journey now for the last 5 years since I first heard about what at the time seemed the completely crazy idea of giving people with cancer diagnoses, terminal cancer diagnoses, a psychedelic experience in the hopes of basically lifting their fear. You should know, though, that I, at your age, had not had a psychedelic experience. I would not have been one of the hand raisers 20 years ago, 30 years ago. So I was psychedelically naive. Frankly, I was too afraid to use psychedelics when I was young. I had absorbed all the horror stories of people, jumping off of buildings thinking they could fly, staring at the sun till they went blind. And at the time, these were, in the journalism. So I stayed away. And for some weird reason, I ended up at a college where there was no psychedelics. So that might have changed things. But I was coming at this from another point of view. I don't know how many of you are familiar with my work, but I had been writing about food and agriculture for many years. Which seems like completely different, but in fact is not. I'm very interested in the ways in which we use plants and fungi to gratify our desires, whether for food or sweetness or and to change consciousness. That has always struck me as one of the most curious things about us. And I learned years ago that every culture on Earth, with one exception, and even that exception I have to put an asterisk on, uses some plant or fungus to change consciousness. It's kind of a remarkable fact. We understand why we use plants to feed ourselves, or to clothe ourselves, or to entertain us and provide beauty, but why would it be adaptive? Why would this desire have survived natural selection to change consciousness? Well, in some ways it sort of makes sense. There are drug plants that relieve pain. That's pretty adaptive. There are others that relieve boredom. There are others like coffee and tea that just kind of sharpen us a little bit, and in fact help us learn and remember. But these more radical ways of changing consciousness, I'd always been curious as to why that is. Because it seems like it would put you at a disadvantage, that you would be kind of discombobulated, you would be vulnerable to prey or accidents. So what advantage did it confer? So this idea, I'd written about this a little bit with regard to cannabis, and I wrote a piece about opium once. But this was in the back of my head. And then I read about this study I just mentioned. And I thought this was so odd and curious. And the other thing that was going on when I read that study was my father had received a terminal diagnosis with cancer. And he was dying. And I don't even know to this day, he died a year and a half ago, how he processed it, but it was very internal. I could not engage him in a conversation about death. So I was kind of thinking about death a lot, and here were these people who had apparently had this experience that removed their fear. So I set out to write about them. I got an assignment from the New Yorker magazine, And I got in touch with the researchers who were at Johns Hopkins University, which is like the leading medical institution in America. I had no idea they were doing psychedelic research. And New York University. And I reached out and started interviewing the researchers and then the patients. And I remember the first interview I had was with a young psychiatrist named Steve Ross at NYU. And he told me that he was 40-ish, that when he went to medical school, he had never heard of psychedelics or psychedelic research, but had gradually gotten interested. Some old-timer had told him about it, and discovered to his astonishment that there had been this 15-year period of very active and very productive research into using both psilocybin and LSD, and to a lesser extent mescaline, to treat various psychiatric conditions. And there had been 1,000 peer-reviewed studies between 1950 and 1965. There had been 6 international conferences about LSD alone. So it was a vibrant part of psychiatric research. And then it died. It just stopped, beginning in the late 60s. And I don't know of another case where you have a productive line of scientific inquiry that is stopped for reasons that are essentially political. Because we were, in America, and this spread to Europe as well, we had a tremendous backlash against psychedelics, beginning right around 1965. And the culture turned on a dime. Before 1965, the press coverage, the journalism around psychedelics was universally enthusiastic. This was the new psychiatric wonder drug. It was being used to treat alcoholism. It was being used to treat depression and the anxiety of cancer patients. And then something happens. And what that was the counterculture's embrace of psychedelics combined with the culture war that was happening in America, especially around the war. American youth were taking psychedelics, and they were being acquainted with a new way of looking at reality that was very threatening to their elders, and especially to their government. And President Nixon regarded drugs, and psychedelics in particular, as an enormous threat to his agenda, and thought it was the reason that American boys were refusing to go fight his war in Vietnam. This never happens, by the way. Usually when you tell an 18-year-old to go fight a war, they go, at least in America. But they were having an experience that caused them to doubt the sanity of doing that. And so he launched the drug war, a drug war that, in fact, he ended up enlisting many governments around the world, including your own, through treaties and political pressure. We now know why he was launching the drug war. It wasn't out of concern for public health. One of his advisors, just a couple years ago, revealed to a journalist, this is John Ehrlichman, who is his chief domestic policy advisor, revealed that, and this is a quote, "The reason we needed a drug war was so we could go after the hippies and the blacks." And that's why we have a drug war. But this drug war and the changing reputation of LSD, because this moment was accompanied by all these stories that started getting a lot of attention about people ending up in psych wards, taking trips from which they never returned, staring at the sun until they go blind. Many of these stories were not true, but they nevertheless circulated widely. And that's where I came in. I came of age in the late 60s. I was 15 in 1970, and I had heard all these stories, and I believed them. So I had my own period of staying away from psychedelics, as did the researchers. And the research basically dries up in the early 70s, and we go 30 or 40 years without any of it happening. So what we're talking about, as the title of this book suggests, is a renaissance in the literal sense. And the work going on today, believe it or not, as innovative as it sounds to most of it, is really a replication of a set of experiments that were done in the 1950s and 60s, although now they're being done with much greater rigor. The scientific gold standard of a double-blind, placebo-controlled study doesn't really start till the 60s. And most of these studies were done in the 50s. So they're being done to much higher standards. And there are also some new experiments going on. Plus, we have new tools like fMRI scanning technology. And let me just tell you a little bit about how it's done, too. Because I think when people hear about psychedelic therapy, they assume that you're just giving somebody a pill, and like you would with another psychiatric medicine. But of course, it's not really psychedelic therapy. It should be called psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, because it's a package where you need a lot of therapeutic support as well as the molecule. And in most cases now, it's psilocybin. Very few people are working with LSD, and the reason for that is both practical and political. LSD carries a lot more political baggage. More people have heard of it, so you're more likely to start a controversy by, say, making a federal grant to study. Some congressman is going to scream about it. Nobody knows what psilocybin is, outside of this room. Not literally, but... and the other reason is it's shorter acting. So, a psilocybin experience is like 4 to 6 hours, whereas an LSD experience can be 8 to 12 hours. And, the researchers want to get home for dinner and see their kids. And so you want something you can fit into the therapeutic day or the scientific day. So they're using psilocybin. But how are they using it? The protocol, some of you know about this, but for those of you who don't, it's very important to understand that the way these drugs are used clinically is very different than the way they're used so-called recreationally. And in this clinical setting, and this goes for both the official approved drug trials and underground therapy, it's pretty much the same. And in fact, the overground therapists borrow from the underground. There's a very interesting traffic between those two that nobody likes to talk about. But basically, it's a 3-step process. It begins, a psychedelic session begins with a preparatory session, a preparation, where the guides, and above ground there are 2, always one man and one woman, and they do a kind of a long interview, taking both a health history and a psychological history, and get to know the volunteer or the patient. And then they prepare them for what's going to happen. Because one of the key facts about psychedelics is, as Timothy Leary noted, although he wasn't the first to think of this, that set and setting have an enormous effect. And by set and setting, he meant the mindset that you approach the experience with, and also the literal setting. So it's the external and internal environment will shape the experience. And that is one way in which psychedelics are very unusual drugs. If you think about cocaine or methamphetamine or heroin, they have very predictable effects over a huge population. Psychedelics are, as one researcher called it, an unspecific mental amplifier. So whatever's going on in your head will be going on a lot more and a lot differently. But the same drug on a different day can yield a completely different kind of experience. So how you organize it for someone, how you prepare them, has a tremendous effect. So you are given a set of flight instructions, as the researchers like to call it, which is to say how to think while you're under the influence. So they will tell you, for example, that you should always go with the experience and don't try to resist it. If you see a door, open it. If you see a staircase, climb it. If you see a monster, step right up to it. Don't be afraid. Look it in the eye and say, what are you doing in my mind, and what do you have to teach me? The basic idea is that if you surrender to the experience, relax your mind and float downstream, as John Lennon put it, you will have a much better experience. And really, the bad trip, as it's often called, is often the result of the desire or the need to kind of stop what's happening. You feel like you're going crazy. You feel like you're melting. Your sense of self is melting. You're dying, and you fight to keep your shit together. And that's the absolute wrong thing to do. So the flight instructions offer this advice, which is critical. And then during the experience, the guides sit with you the whole time. They don't say very much because they want you to go where your mind is going to take you. But they're there, they'll offer you a hand, they'll help you get up and go to the bathroom or give you a sip of water. And they sit there. It's kind of boring work, I would imagine, but necessary work because it gives you this sense of comfort that someone's looking out for your body so your mind is free to travel. As one of the researchers said, think of us as mission control on the ground, and you are the space shuttle going out into space. And don't worry, we've got you covered here. And that's incredibly reassuring. You're also wearing eye shades. And to people who have used the drug recreationally, this is almost an offensive concept. But the idea is to block out the kind of fireworks, the sensory fireworks that are happening, so you can go inward. Because these are meant to be therapeutic journeys. And you're listening to music on a headphone. And there's lots of different playlists. If you go on Spotify, you can listen to the Johns Hopkins playlist, which is, I think, quite beautiful. It has a lot of choral and classical music, but it gets some grief for being, too many old white men. And then there's a more modernist playlist at NYU, which has, John Cage and Philip Glass and all this kind of spatialized music. And then at Imperial College in London, they're actually composing music. And they've enlisted Brian Eno to help them come up with, music for the psychedelic experience, which I'm looking forward to. So that's the experience. That goes on for about 6 hours. And then afterwards, you come back the next day for what's called an integration session. And that's critically important also, because very often the experience is confusing. Many people have had psychedelic experiences where all sorts of weird things happen, and incapable of interpreting it, as we often are, we put it in a box labeled weird drug experience. But of course, it's not a weird drug experience, although it is also that. It's the products of your own mind. This is important information, and it can be interpreted with the help of a professional, a therapist of some kind. So you go through this process, you tell the story of what happened, and with the help of your guide or therapist, you kind of make sense of it and figure out what you can take from that experience and apply to the conduct of your life. So in a way, it's the most important part. And that goes on for a couple hours. It could go on for years, frankly, because there's a lot of interesting mystery that comes up. So that's the way it works. When you do it this way, in this very carefully supervised and assisted way, the chances of it really mitigates risk. Things are much less likely to go wrong. And I want to talk a little bit about risk, because it's very important to acknowledge and understand what are the risks and what is the, bullshit. I looked at this very carefully because by the time I was going to take psychedelics, I was in my late 50s, and I wasn't that reckless 18-year-old that you can send off to war. And I wanted to know what I was doing to my body. And so I looked very closely at the whole... By the way, you have excellent water here. I'm thinking of taking some home. So I looked at it very closely. I did a lot of research. And what I found was kind of amazing to me. I first looked at how toxic are these drugs. Well, it turns out they're not toxic. They're remarkably non-toxic. There are very few drugs in existence that are less toxic than LSD and psilocybin. And DMT. You have drugs in your medicine cabinet, acetaminophen or something like that, Tylenol, that you take a handful of pills and you can destroy your liver and kill yourself. There is no known lethal dose for LSD or psilocybin, which is quite remarkable. They did manage once to kill an elephant with LSD, with this massive dose, but they also had given the elephant, it's the cruelest experiment I've ever heard of. They also had to give it a massive amount of tranquilizers so it would sit for this massive amount of LSD. So there's no conclusion to be drawn from that. But the drugs are non-toxic, no lethal dose. Then what about addictiveness, right? Are they habit-forming? No, they're not habit-forming. And those of you who have experience, and it's almost all of you, know that your first reaction after completing this what can be a very arduous and, it's hard work, and it's a big experience, and your first reaction is not, where can I get some more? It's like, do I ever have to do this again? And a certain amount of time has to go by before you can even contemplate doing it again. So it's not habit forming. And we know this too in animal studies, that those classic studies where you put the rat in the cage and you give them two levers and one administers the drug to their veins and the other administers sugar water. And if you put in cocaine or methamphetamine, they keep pressing it until they die. If you put a rat in that setup and you do it with LSD, they will try it once and never again. Animals don't like to trip. Partly because the set and setting problem. We can't really adequately prepare them. It's something to work on. So anyway, knowing all this, I also was interviewing people, and I just want to give you a sense of the kinds of experiences I learned about that in the end made it seem imperative that I try this myself. I remember one of the early interviews was with a woman, a survivor of ovarian cancer named Dina Baser. She was a New Yorker. She was a figure skating instructor, and she was kind of a small, timid-seeming woman who had ovarian cancer. It had been treated successfully. It was in remission, but she was absolutely crippled by the fear it was going to come back, that the other shoe was going to drop at any moment. And she heard about this trial at NYU and enrolled and had her psilocybin experience after the kind of preparation I was describing. And like a lot of the cancer patients, she went into her body in the trip, imaginatively. It's sort of this waking dream, and she went inside her body. And many of the cancer patients have an encounter with their cancer. In her case, she's inside her body, touring it in a way, and sees this black mass under her rib cage. So she knows it's not her cancer, it's not in the right place, but she immediately recognizes it, and she realizes, that is my fear. That black mass was her fear. And she spontaneously screams out. Now imagine the two guides who are sitting there. They have no idea what's going on inside her head. They're just sitting there quietly meditating, taking notes, and she screams, "Get the fuck out of my body!" And when she does this, the black mass just disappears. And from that moment on, her fear of recurrence was gone. And she said she had, during the experience, the realization that though she could not control her cancer, she could control her fear, her response to it. And this insight, under the influence of psilocybin, stuck with her and allowed her to overcome her fear, and it was gone. We were talking a little bit after she told the story, and she had told me before the story that I asked if she was a spiritual person in my interview, and she said, "No, I'm a stone-cold atheist." But then as she was telling the story, after her fear disappeared, she had this ecstatic experience, and she said, "And I kissed the face of God." And I said, "So you're not an atheist anymore?" And she said, "No, I'm still an atheist." And I said, "Well, how can you kiss the face of God and be an atheist?" She said, "Well, we just don't have a word big enough for what this experience was. It was ineffable. And God is the biggest word we have. And so that's the word I'm using." It was quite beautiful. So she's doing very well, and she has not had any fear. So a single experience took care of that for her. Quite remarkable. Then there's another woman in a different study. This was a study to stop smoking, which has been one of the more interesting addiction studies going on, and at Johns Hopkins, not NYU. And there, after one or two experiences, having a lot of success getting people to give up what is a very difficult habit to break. And I met this woman named Alice O'Donnell, and she's Irish, and she's a book editor in her 60s. And she said she had this spectacular trip that she found, for the most part, very, very happy. She said she found she had the freedom to go anywhere in the course of her journey. She grew feathers that allowed her to fly through European history, and she visited all these sites of European history. She died 3 times. She watched her soul move from her body to a funeral pyre floating on the Ganges, and found herself standing on the edge of the universe, witnessing the dawn of creation. It's a pretty big trip. She also had the humbling realization that everything in the universe is of equal importance, including herself. And she said a part of my brain that had gone to sleep was awakened. And this is what she concluded. The universe was so great, and there were so many things you could do and see that killing yourself seemed like a dumb idea. It put smoking in a whole new context. Smoking seemed very unimportant. It seemed kind of stupid, to be honest. Now, this is not a profound realization, right? But there's something about the quality of the realizations people have on psychedelics that renders them very authoritative. William James, the American psychologist, talked about this. He wrote about the mystical experience, which is what is going on here. And he said that mystical experiences have something called a noetic quality, that what you see, what you observe, the insights you have are not opinions. They feel like knowledge, objective knowledge, as if they were on stone tablets. And that seems to be happening with the addicts. They're coming to conclusions about their habit, that they had, a new perspective on it that renders it seem unimportant or stupid. And that insight, which of course they've had at other times, and people have told them it's a bad habit, but now they can change their lives on the basis of that idea. And that's quite remarkable and still kind of inexplicable, but there it is. So what's going on in the mind during these experiences? Well, as I kind of alluded to, the best predictor for success is someone having a complete mystical experience. Now, mystical experience doesn't sound like a scientific term, but in fact, there is a whole literature of it, and the psychologists who... are there any psychologists or therapists in the room? So, research psychologists have a scale for everything, right, and a survey for everything. And they have done a mystical experience questionnaire and survey. And the mystical experience includes such things as ego dissolution, this sense that you've transcended your separateness as a person, followed by emerging with a larger entity. You feel like what's called unitive consciousness, part of something bigger, a sense of sacredness and meaning, a positive mood, and transcendence of space and time, and the noetic quality that I mentioned, and ineffability. The experience is somehow beyond the reach of our language or even our concepts to understand. And so the people who had what qualified as a complete mystical experience, which is about 2/3 of the people in these trials, they reliably got better, whatever they were dealing with, whether it was addiction or depression. So I think that's very interesting. What's going on at the level of the brain? We have a pretty imperfect understanding, but a few interesting clues. We know what brain receptors are activated by these drugs, serotonin 2A receptor. But the interesting finding recently, when they did fMRI scans of people while they were in the acute stage of the experience, is that they expected to find this kind of hyperactivity and lots of brain areas lighting up. But in fact, they found that one very important brain network was quieted, kind of went offline, and that's the default mode network. And that network, which involves several different structures in the midline and connects the prefrontal cortex to these older, deeper centers of emotion, as well as the posterior cingulate cortex, which is very involved in the autobiographical self. This network went quiet. Now, what does this network do? Well, it's very involved in generating our sense of a self. Self-reflection takes place here. Theory of mind, the ability to imagine a self that other people have a point of view, which is a uniquely human trait as far as we know. Time travel, the ability to think about the future and the past, which of course you need to be able to do to have a self. In the absence of memory or a sense of futurity, you don't have a self. and this autobiographical memory, the faculty that allows us to take what happens in our lives and weave it into the story of who we are. So the default mode network is where we tell ourselves the story of who we are and have a sense of continuity. And that network goes quiet. Now, that network is also involved in regulating the whole brain. The brain is a hierarchical system, and the default mode network is at the top, giving orders. It's one researcher called it the orchestra conductor or corporate executive of the brain. And when that goes offline, other brain networks start talking to each other, sometimes for the first time. Because normally they go through that central hub, but suddenly, and there's an image on the flyleaf that shows you this, the brain gets rewired from this, a few big superhighways linking different networks to all these new little roads connecting things. And that may explain something like synesthesia, the phenomenon of one sense kind of talking to another, so that suddenly you can see sound or smell it. And that cross-wiring, which is a powerful part of psychedelic experience. So the brain is temporarily rewired, and that may be what frees people from the stuckness of depression, the stuckness of anxiety and obsession and addiction. The kinds of things that psychedelics work best on are mental disorders characterized by rigidity of thinking. People who are stuck in loops of rumination, habits of thought and behavior they can't get out of. And the psychedelics disturb those connections, and as some volunteers put it, allow you to reboot your brain. Like when your computer is getting really kludgy and it's been running for a really long time and there are too many programs open, you turn it off and reboot, and suddenly it's operating much differently. So it's kind of a shock to the system that allows new patterns to form and breaks old patterns. At least that's the current thinking. So, as I suggested, it's good for that set of disorders characterized by rigidity or too much order in the brain. It's not good for disorders characterized by not enough order, too much entropy in the brain, too much chaos, like schizophrenia and personality disorders and mania. So that may explain why it works on the disorders it works on. They're all on that side of the brain that needs a little noise or disorder injected into the system. So that's the current thinking. There's lots of promise here, but it's going to be challenging to incorporate psychedelics in conventional therapy. If you think about it, it's a real problem for the business model for the pharmaceutical industry, since we're talking about products, chemicals that can't be patented, that grow wild, and in the case of LSD is out of patent, and that you only take once or twice. How do you make money on that if you're a pharmaceutical company? And that's why the pharmaceutical industry is not interested at the moment anyway. It's also a challenge, though, for psychotherapy, for people who, have a business model based on the weekly visit that goes on forever. And here you need tons of psychological support, but over a very short amount of time. So figuring this out, it's a different paradigm. And it's also a different paradigm in the sense that what you're administering is yes, there's a drug, but the active ingredient, if you will, is the experience. If you don't have the experience, this big experience of ego dissolution, it doesn't work very well. And that's a new paradigm too, that you change people with a certain kind of experience rather than a different chemistry. The chemistry kicks it off, but finally it's the experience. So we'll see. It's going to take some real innovation to figure out how to bring this into the mainstream. Now, what about the rest of us? What about those of us who don't have, a diagnosable ailment, mental disorder? Well, I think that it has enormous value for what one of my characters in the book calls the betterment of well people, which is a lovely phrase and awkward at the same time. And that's for a couple reasons. One is mental illness doesn't exist in a vacuum, or a box over here. I mean, we are all on a spectrum. Everyone has periods of depression. Everyone has periods of anxiety. All of us have habits of thought or behavior we'd like very much to break. So there is value, even though you're not clinically depressed or clinically anxious. And that becomes another challenge. How do you make it available to people who aren't sick? And that is going to take some work too. I don't think the answer is simply to legalize it. I think the drugs are too powerful. I think they need a container, at least at high doses. They need a certain kind of container. So we can talk about that later. But I want to just end by telling you a little bit about my own experience. Because as I alluded to at the beginning, I became intensely curious and a little jealous, actually, of the people I was interviewing, that I wanted to see what this was about. It's also the way I like to write. I usually put myself in my books and do something that puts me in a position to understand something well. So when I wrote about the cattle industry for a book called The Omnivore's Dilemma, I bought a cow and followed it through the whole meat system. When I wanted to write about genetically modified crops, I got some potatoes from Monsanto and put them in my garden. So this is kind of what I do and what my readers expect me to do. But I really wanted to do this, even though I was terrified. The night before each of my 8 or so journeys on several different psychedelics, I had a sleepless night, tossing and turning, worrying, like, what are you doing? You're going to be on the top of this mountain with this underground guide. What if you have a heart attack? Is he going to call an ambulance? And what if you discover something horrifying about yourself, or you realize you're actually really crazy? And it went back and forth, and then the other side of me was like, well, aren't you curious? Don't you want to know what would happen? And by the way, you have a book to write. And that dialogue each time was resolved in favor of doing it. I know now in retrospect that voice that was trying to stop me from doing it was the voice of my ego. Because the ego is heavily challenged by psychedelics. And the ego is very clever. It has the mastery of your rational faculties and was trying to keep me from doing this. But I won that battle, whoever I is, which actually goes to the point of this passage I want to read. So I had this guided trip, the most powerful of my experiences. It's funny, when I started talking about the book, I would ask audiences, do you want to hear about a good trip or a bad trip? And they would all go, bad trip! But I'm not going to tell you about a bad trip. I'm going to tell you about a good trip that had some bad parts. So I'm with this woman I call Mary. She's a wonderful therapist, incredibly compassionate. I felt this bond with her, this trust with her. It's exactly what you want in a guide. But she puts on this really crappy music. And it's this New Age composition by this guy named Thierry David, and it just has that insipid New Age feeling, which is just not my thing. And I looked him up later, and he was nominated 3 times for Best Chill Groove Album, whatever that category is. But note, he was only nominated. He didn't even win that category. But the music, because of synesthesia, starts producing this landscape. Every note, a stalactite or stalagmite comes out, and it's creating this weird computer-generated landscape, and it's black and white and gray. There's no color, and I'm trapped in it. And I have her change the music, and it doesn't go away. And I spend, I don't know, it felt like an eternity trapped in this computer world. And finally, I was getting a little paranoid that I'm going to be stuck here all afternoon. And so I took off my eye shades, and the world returned, and there were windows and walls and color, and the light was, fractal and extraordinary, and every beam of light was like talking to me. And I got up to use the bathroom, and I'm very careful not to look in the mirror. And I mentioned this to an audience in England, and they said, yes. Somebody in the audience says, yes, trip face, to be avoided. And I peed, and I produced this spectacular crop of diamonds. And then I came back out, and Mary, who is actually quite a Nordic-looking woman with like long blonde hair, parted in the middle and high cheekbones. She offers me a booster, another mushroom, and she's sort of squatting next to the bed I was on, and she said, "Do you want more?" And I said, "Yes." And I looked at her, and she had been transformed into a Mexican Indian. She had black hair and this leathery brown skin and these wrinkled hands. And I knew exactly who she turned into. She was Maria Sabina, who's a legendary figure in psychedelic history, the first Mexican Indian to give psilocybin to a Westerner, to Gordon Wasson in 1956. And I read about that, and she became that person. I decided not to tell her what had happened to her, and took the dose and went back under. And then the most incredible thing happened, and I just want to read you a brief page or two about it, because I think it goes to the heart of the experience, or where it can take you. When I put my eye shades back on and lay down, I was disappointed to find myself back in computer world, but something had changed, no doubt the result of the stepped-up dose. Whereas before I navigated this landscape as myself, taking in the scene from a perspective recognizable as my own, with my attitudes intact, highly critical of the music, for instance, and anxious about what demons might appear, now I watched as that familiar self began to fall apart before my eyes, gradually at first, and then all at once. I now turned into a sheaf of little papers, no bigger than Post-it notes, and they were being scattered to the wind. But the I, taking in this seeming catastrophe, had no desire to chase after those slips, no desire to put my old self back together, no desires of any kind whatsoever. In fact, whoever I now was fine with whatever happened. No ego? That was okay. In fact, it seemed like the most natural thing in the world. And then I looked and saw myself out there again, but this time spread over the landscape like paint or butter, thinly coating a wide expanse of the world with a substance I recognized as me. But who was this I that was able to take in the scene of its own dissolution? Good question. It wasn't me exactly. Here the limits of our language become a problem. In order to completely make sense of the divide that had opened up in my perspective, I would need a whole new third-person pronoun. For what was observing the scene was a vantage and mode of awareness entirely distinct from my usual self. In fact, I hesitate to use the I to denote the presiding awareness. It was so different from my usual first-person perspective. Where that self had always been a subject, a thinking subject encapsulated in this body, this one was unbounded by anybody, even though I now had access to its perspective. That perspective was supremely indifferent, neutral on all questions of interpretation, and unperturbed even in the face of what should by all rights have been an unmitigated personal disaster. Yet the personal had been obliterated. Everything I once was and called me, this self, 6 decades in the making, had been liquefied and dispersed over the scene. What had always been a thinking, feeling, perceiving subject based in here was now an object out there. I was paint. The sovereign ego, with all its armaments and fears, its backward-looking resentments and forward-looking worries, was simply no more, and there was no one left to mourn its passing. Yet something had succeeded it, this bare, disembodied awareness which gazed upon the scene of the self's dissolution with benign indifference. I was present to reality, but as something other than myself. And although there was no self left to feel exactly, there was a feeling tone, which was calm, unburdened, content. There was life after the death of the ego. This seemed like big news. So that was kind of the most remarkable experience I have had on psychedelics. And it convinced me of something which I had never realized, which is that we are not identical to our egos. That voice that's chattering at us all the time, telling us to look out for ourselves, that tends to be kind of selfish and defensive, and self-critical at the same time, you exist even in its absence, and that there might be other forms of consciousness that aren't so self-centered, literally. So the next morning I went to see Mary to do my integration, and I won't take you through all of it, but just one point she made which stuck with me. I told her what had happened, that I had, figured out there was another ground on which to stand besides ego consciousness, and she said, well, isn't that worth the price of admission? And I said, yeah, but, my ego is back today, back in uniform, on patrol, doing its usual stuff. And so what good is that? And this goes to the question of how enduring are the insights we have on psychedelics. And she said, well, it's actually very important because you have sampled another way of being, another way of meeting the world and meeting the people in your life. And you can cultivate that. You can cultivate that way of seeing. And I asked her how, and she said, well, meditation. Meditation is a classic way to cultivate that way of seeing. And indeed, that launched me on a meditation practice. And I find I can access that kind of consciousness in meditation. Not every day, but every now and then. And that epiphany has had a lasting effect on me. And I think has changed. I just kind of have some distance on my ego. And I can, I know when he's up to his old tricks, and I can somehow ignore him. So there's a recognition here that I think applies not just to me as an individual, but to the culture. I think that, if you think about the big problems we face as a civilization, I would say the two biggest are the environmental crisis and tribalism. And they're both similar in certain ways. They both involve seeing the world as objects, whether it's nature or other people, and the arrogance of thinking we are the only thinking subject. They're both the products of egoic or egotistical consciousness. When the ego shrinks, or disappears in my case, the walls come down, because the ego builds walls. And you suddenly see nature as something you are part of, equally subjective. And same with other kinds of people, very different people. This seems to me exactly the sort of thinking we need to cultivate. The challenge is, though, if this drug does indeed push individuals in the right direction, and we have research to suggest this, by the way, the shrinks have psychologists have another scale, which is nature connectedness. How connected do you feel to nature? Do you feel like you're in nature or stand outside? And after a psychedelic experience, and I know this was true for me, and I'll bet it was true for a lot of you, you feel more connected, more part of nature, more interconnected. And so this is valuable. This is a valuable tool. The challenge, though, and it may be an insurmountable challenge, is how do you administer a drug to an entire civilization? And what happens when you give it to certain people in that civilization who may react in unpredictable ways? I'm thinking of our president, of course, because as soon as I start talking this way, someone always asks the question, can we give this to Trump? And I have to remind them that he has the nuclear codes. And it might not be such a good idea, because you really have to have the intention. You have to go in this direction. But that's something I'll leave you with. Like, how do you, if you have a drug that fosters the kind of consciousness that could help us solve our problems, what do you do? Do you administer it to make it available to people who are very influential and hope that that kind of consciousness filters down? That's what Aldous Huxley wanted to do in the 50s. Or do you try to democratize it like Timothy Leary and tell everybody to turn on, tune in, and drop out? And that didn't work too well. I mean, it did work well in one way, but not in another way. So I'll leave you with that. I'm going to stop now and invite my philosopher friend to come up and join me for questions. But thank you so much for listening. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Can you hear me? Great. Thank you for...
Oh, thank you.
I'd like to start by thanking you both for a great talk, and also just to thank you for being so courageous, because you've entered, even if you're among friends here, you've entered a very controversial area. You're bringing the genre of trip reports into the mainstream, where it hasn't been for a while. And you're also putting yourself in a rather stigmatized group, the group of people who have used illicit drugs. So I wondered, could you tell me a bit about what you expected or what you feared that writing a book like this would result in, and were those fears or expectations met?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I had some trepidation, some nervousness when I published this book, especially about the law. I was confessing to felonies, to Schedule I crimes, and I had the book lawyered very carefully. I was concerned to protect myself, which was really a matter of, you'll see when you read the book, that I never say what state anything happened in, and I never say exactly what year it was, and it's very hard to tell. So it makes the confession inadmissible or useless. But I was also concerned about my sources. So I worked with several underground guides who were trusting me to disguise their identity sufficiently that they wouldn't get into trouble. And that was a huge responsibility. They wouldn't tell me what to do. They were just like, take care of me. And I wanted to make sure that I had protected them adequately. The challenge for a journalist is once you do that, if someone decides to go after those sources, you have to be willing to go to jail to protect them. And that's a big commitment. And fortunately, nothing has happened to my guides or to me. But it was entirely possible it could have. If the government decided they wanted to stop this whole underground community, they just had to arrest one person and they would have kind of froze it. Knock on wood, that hasn't happened. In terms of my reputation, I wasn't that concerned. I have a very kind of candid, honest relationship with my readers, and I trusted them to go with me on this journey, and I was taking it on their behalf in a sense. In the event, the reception of the book has been far more encouraging and positive than I ever would have imagined. I really thought I'd get resistance from the psychiatric community, for example. But as it turns out, the psychiatric community in the United States, at least, is very interested, very curious, not yet sold, but is eager to see this research be done. The first article that I alluded to that I published about this was in The New Yorker. And it was a long piece, and it was before any of the research had been published. And the last week, my editor got cold feet about the whole thing. He got really nervous that he was publishing a very positive piece on psychedelics, and he would get a lot of grief. So I got a call saying, you've got to find an establishment person in the mental health community who thinks this is all bullshit. And put that negative quote way up high. And I'm thinking, who am I going to call? I have like a day. And I realized, all right, I'm going to call the head of the National Institute of Mental Health, who is our chief shrink, I guess, and in charge of the research money. His name is Tom Insuller, was then, and I reached him. He was at Davos at some meeting, and I get him on the phone, and I tell him, so we're doing this really weird research, and what do you think? And he says, I think it's fascinating, actually, and we need to pursue it. We need to see if this will work because we really need some new tools. So there was a desperation, I think, in the psychiatric community for innovation. So in general, just much more embracing than I ever expected. So I feel very fortunate about that, and it's just a sign that, we journalists are not visionaries. If we're a little bit ahead of the curve, that's great. But that there was a wave building here, and that the book kind of captured.
I'm glad to hear that it hasn't been too harsh on you, the criticism that you've met. But then you're taking a very, I think, moderate position in both in the book and in the talk that you just gave about, for example, the dangers involved in the use of such drugs. At least if used recklessly, it seems can have pretty harmful effects. And you also wrote in the New York Times about maybe we haven't come far enough to actually legalize these drugs. Maybe we shouldn't pursue legalization. Decriminalization maybe, but perhaps not legalization. I wondered, have you gotten any pushback from the psychedelic community?
Yeah.
Where people criticize you for not having gone far enough?
Yes. Oh, yeah. No, I got a lot of pushback about that. And I had a kind of nuanced position that is hard to encapsulate in a short New York Times op-ed piece. But, I mean, I've had this very interesting conversation with the people, with audiences about this question. And my issue, I do support decriminalization. It seems absurd to me that you could go to jail for ingesting a mushroom that you can find, in the ground. And it just, that's your own body. You should be able to do that. But legalization is different. When we legalize these drugs, I think we first need to do it through the medical system. That is a form of legalization, and it's based on research and proof that these drugs work and as advertised. And my concern is if we have a big fight now about legalization for everybody else, two concerns. One is that capitalism will get involved in the sale of psilocybin. Capitalism is very eager to go here. There's a lot of capital that was created with legal marijuana in the US and Canada, and its next target of opportunity is psilocybin. And I don't know that we want to be pushing psilocybin on people with the kind of intensity that corporations will bring to it. Because it's not for everybody. There are really people at risk for serious mental disorders that should not take it. People need to be carefully screened. And I do believe if people are taking high doses that they need to be in an have optimized set and setting, which simply by legalizing something you don't ensure. Now there may be ways to do it and with certified guides or at clinics that are prepared to deal with adverse events, but we haven't figured that out yet. And I think we need to. But my objection is about timing. As I said, I think I was very clear that I think there is a place in the lives of so-called, healthy normals for psychedelics, and that they can be very valuable. And I didn't even talk about the spiritual side of it and the religious significance for some people. But in politics, you don't only choose your battles, you choose the timing of your battles. And right now, we have psilocybin and MDMA, or ecstasy, going through this regulatory approval process. It has encountered very little resistance. The bureaucrats, the regulators, are treating them like any other drug. It has not been politicized. It has not fallen into the American black and white Republican-Democrat trap. And I worry that a big campaign for legalization now will interfere with that process, that the regulators will get nervous, that political pressure will be brought to bear on one way or the other. So I just think let's do that first. That's close. These are the people who started it, who are bringing it back. Let them finish their work, and then we can talk about legalizing it for everybody else.
I think you're right.
Thank you. By the way, I also think that once it is a prescribable drug, it will be available to everybody else. I mean, lots of people see therapists who aren't clinically depressed or clinically anxious. They have problems. They're working on their relationships. They're working on their self-esteem. And they will have access. They can be prescribed these drugs too and brought into these. So I think it will happen.
So if we imagine that things go well, no one makes any big mistakes that creates a big, political pushback against this. Let's say things go well. How do things then look, say 10 or 15 years into the future? What might be a role for psychedelics in culture? Would people, I'm an academic philosopher, would I be able to use psychedelics, for example?
Oh, definitely.
Aid in my research?
You guys will be first in line.
Would be first. What is the case today is that if you use a psychedelic, you can be put in prison. Maybe we could reverse that. Maybe if you're put in prison, if you've committed a crime, you could be given a psychedelic to maybe, reflect on what you've done. For example, could.
Now you're thinking.
Could.
Well, Timothy Leary did do an experiment with violent criminals in the early 60s, and he went into the prisons, and his thought was if he gave these murderers and rapists psychedelics, that they would have lower rates of recidivism. And there's a very funny story where he's sitting. In those days, the researchers insisted on taking the drug themselves because they didn't want to treat the volunteers as guinea pigs. It seemed like the fairer thing to do. And so he's sitting there with this African-American murderer, and he noticed the guy is like sweating and nervous, and he says to him, why are you nervous? I should be nervous. You're a murderer. And the guy says, yeah, but you're a fucking mad scientist. And the experiment didn't work. The rates of recidivism after a certain amount of time were the same, but it wasn't a very well-controlled experiment. So, but your point is, what is this world like? And we have to invent that world. It doesn't exist yet. We need to create a container for this experience. As I said, it's not just psychedelics, it's psychedelic assisted, right? The therapeutic support, I think, is very important, or the kind of guidance that I had. And so we have a container for medical application, the thing I described with the 3 steps and the 2 guides. And that seems to work pretty well in this psychiatric context. And then on the other side, I didn't talk about, but there's a religious container that already exists. It's the Ayahuasca Circle, led by a shaman. It's the Native American church, where the roadman is kind of a shaman, and he gives peyote to the group, and the group heals. And these are legal in America already. They have constitutional protection because it's religious freedom. But what about in the middle? Well, we need to design that container. It might look like one or the other. Is it going to be in groups or individuals? Is it going to be in clinics, or is it going to be in beautiful outdoor settings? Maybe there's a kind of spa. Maybe there's a mental health spa that we'll go to. All remains to be decided, and it's important work for architects. It's important work for composers, to kind of design this. I think it's one of the more exciting cultural projects, actually, is to figure out how to do this. But we should keep in mind the deep lessons of the past, which is to say, psychedelics burst upon the West in the 1950s and really in the 60s, and they came without an instruction manual. And we were too arrogant to look at other cultures that used them at the time. But in fact, there are traditional cultures all over the world that have used psychedelics without causing too much disruption, and in fact having a very positive effect. I'm talking about the shamans in South America and the curanderas in Mexico and the ancient Greeks who apparently used a psychedelic in their rituals. So what do we know? What did they learn with those thousands of years of trial and error? Well, they learned that you don't do it alone. They learned that usually there's an elder involved in some way to guide people, to help people. They learn that you do it with a clear sense of intention, a reason to do it. You don't just do it for fun. And they learn that you surround it with ritual and ceremony and stabilize it with that kind of traditional elements. So it remains, what's the modern Western version of that? That's really the question. And I'll be very excited to see. I can't design it, but it will be designed, I think.
We'll hope that it will be, and it's a really interesting area.
Things could blow up. We shouldn't. You alluded to that. There could be another backlash. It's not out of the question, and that argues for some care that the researchers are all acutely aware of.
So maybe we should try to do as much as we can before it reaches the public full force. And maybe it's best to have designed all of these things before it actually gets there.
Yeah, well, look, there was a lot of kind of wonderful use of psychedelics in the 60s, but there was also a lot of recklessness. People thought it was cool to put it in the punch bowl and dose people without their permission. This seems absolutely insane now, but people didn't know. And so I think, that everybody being kind of thoughtful and sane about it is the best thing. But bad things will happen. We're doing a trial for depression. Hundreds of people are going to be given psilocybin to treat their depression at 8 sites in Europe and another 8 or so in the US. And there will be some suicides. likely. I mean, you're dealing with clinically depressed people, and if those suicides plug into that narrative of psychedelics, people jumping off of buildings, it could be a big story. It could blow up. Even though, of course, people on antidepressants commit suicide all the time. It's a known risk factor. So I think, we have to be aware of that possibility and do what we can to prevent it from happening.
Yeah. It seems that if there's going to be a psychedelic renaissance, or if it's going to be a bigger psychedelic renaissance, and if this is going to be a part of culture, either a lot of people have to use psychedelics, or a lot of people who haven't used psychedelics will need to think that this is okay. But then we face the problem of explaining to those who have never used these drugs what they are like. And it's really difficult to explain what something feels like, from a subjective perspective. If someone asks you just, how does the color red look? It's very hard to describe that. You can point to other red things and hope that people have had a similar experience. Or the taste of a tomato. How does it actually taste? It's really hard to find words for describing subjective experiences. And that seems to be part of the problem, perhaps, with psychedelics as well. With the most intense trip that you describe in the book, with 5-MeO-DMT, you describe it as indescribable.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering, do you think this is one of the central problems in discussing psychedelics in public, that people just don't understand what it is like, and maybe we just can't explain either? And if you think that's a problem, what do we do about it?
Well, I do think it's a problem, and I approach the chapters where I describe my own experience with a lot of trepidation. These were tremendous literary challenges. How do you describe a psychedelic trip to someone who hasn't had one? And everybody talks about it's ineffable, but finally we have to F it, and that's the job of writers, right? And look at consciousness is very hard to describe too. And Proust has done a wonderful job, and Virginia Woolf and James Joyce, and it takes a lot of work, but that's what literature does or can do. And you have to decide for yourself whether I succeeded in getting it across, and it was not easy to do, but once I kind of found my voice and a way to talk about it, which meant, you'll see when you read these passages, I kind of alternate being inside the experience, and it sounds kind of crazy, and I'm turning into butter, and then I step out of the experience and acknowledge how crazy it sounds, and I kind of toggle back and forth between normal consciousness and this other consciousness, and hoping that will bring people in. But it's why we have writing. It's why it remains a fantastic technology. It can reproduce consciousness on the page, and film can do it too. But I mean, I've yet to see really fine cinematic renditions of psychedelic experience. It always ends up with some kaleidoscope, or Paisley, I mean, there are these cliches, and I think that's a wonderful challenge out there for filmmakers to see if they can render, because it's a much more subtle experience than it ever appears in those 60s movies. But yeah, I think it is a challenge of conveying it to people. But people who are suffering, people who are dying, people who have been depressed since 1991, like one woman I interviewed, they're willing to take the leap, even if they don't understand. Because they're at the ends of their ropes, and this offers a certain hope. So I think the best case you make for psychedelics is helping people who are suffering. And if we see people getting better, I think the society will embrace it. And, you think about the dying, we have so little to offer them. We have morphine, which dulls the mind. And here we have something that actually sharpens the mind, clarifies the experience, and makes it and increases allows people sometimes, at least, to die with equanimity. That's the best case. I think that's really the best case.
It actually struck me when I read your book that, in a sense, a book is a mind-altering substance as well. It's a certain chemical structure that exists, and you interact with it. Then it creates images and thoughts in your mind. So in a sense, it is like a trip in a way to
Completely.
read a book.
I
especially a good
totally
book.
agree. When you read a book, you let someone else kind of occupy a large piece of your consciousness for a period of time. It's a huge responsibility, and you can induce people to have emotions and have experiences, and yeah, it's absolutely a wonderful thing.
And it's magic in a way that books are allowed. People have done so many crazy things.
Don't
because
tell them.
of reading a book. That seems to be, books in general. I'm not sure.
Well, there have been
very
periods,
good...
of course, where they have been banned and burned for just that reason. I mean, they are very threatening to some people for exactly those reasons. Books can change minds.
They can.
And in the same way that people freaked out about psychedelics changing minds,
Is there any aspect of your book that you've felt is often misunderstood?
I don't think so. I mean, the kinds of criticisms I've heard that I find interesting is some people felt I didn't give enough credit to theories of consciousness that were not brain-produced consciousness. That, there are many people in this community and in the world who actually are not convinced that brains generate consciousness. The consciousness may be a field that we tune into. And that's an interesting idea. I've always assumed brains produce consciousness, which is the default position. But the more I've looked into it, actually, there's no good reason to believe that. The scientists have no idea, actually. As the Dalai Lama said, it's an interesting hypothesis, and it's all it is. So that I didn't give enough credit to so-called transpersonal theories of consciousness. So I was kind of stuck in my materialism. So that was one. And that I didn't pay enough attention to traditional uses. I didn't go to South America and explore but I was really sticking kind of close to the science. And that was part of the challenge. When I was writing this book, I wasn't writing it for the psychedelic community. I was writing it for people who are not in the psychedelic community first. And so how do you persuade people to take something seriously in our culture? Well, it's science. Science is very powerful, has enormous authority. I don't think it's the last word on everything, but if you, as a rhetorical matter, it offers the best resources for convincing people to take something seriously. And so I tended to stay pretty close to the science and not look so much at this, wonderful shamanic tradition, but maybe in another book someday.
But you mentioned materialism. Have you changed your outlook on the world?
I knew the philosopher would grab that one.
Because it seems like an interesting question. One is, of course, the personal psychological effect, but the other is the effect on one's view of the world, one's view on what is possible, what the world contains. Maybe it doesn't just contain matter, maybe it contains something else, or maybe matter is something different from what we thought it was.
Absolutely. It opened up questions. It didn't provide answers on those questions, but it made me think that I was a little too thoughtless in accepting a way of conceiving reality. I mean, the scene I described, that you could have consciousness without a self, is very pregnant with needs to be thought through, and I haven't yet. It's sort of this koan that I'm still working on, that you can have consciousness without a sense of self. That we kind of assume that self is at the very heart of what it is to be conscious, that you need a self to be conscious. So what is that thing without one? That's one thing. The other thing is the subject-object duality that I alluded to, that we think of ourselves as thinking, feeling subjects, and the rest of the world, except for a select group of other people who look like us and are probably related to us, are objects, more or less. And depending on your politics, they're more object-like or less. And nature is a bunch of objects. And another experience I had that was really profound, and this was an unguided psilocybin trip, was in my garden, where I felt I don't want to say consciousness, but the subjectivity of all the flowers and plants in my garden. They were just as conscious or subjective. They had their own point of view, not just me. And I was just one species among many. And there were dragonflies going around and birds and I felt, most of us walk through nature and we feel slightly alienated, right? We stand, what other species has a relationship to nature like we do? That's a crazy idea, but that's a very important part of our identity, at least in the West, that we have 1 foot in nature, 1 foot out. Well, both feet were in nature. I was just one critter among many. And that raises interesting questions about the point of view of other subjects and how we treat them. So, without question, many interesting philosophical issues arise, and I look forward to the day where it becomes a standard part of a philosopher's education to have a psychedelic experience and help us think it through.
Would be wonderful, because I think many of the things that you allude to here will actually be pretty welcome in the philosophical community. I think many philosophers hold ideas that, at least to some extent, resemble what you say. And when it comes to the subject-object distinction, for example, there is a growing number of philosophers who think, that we are subjects, but we're also objects. Obviously, you're an object, I'm an object, so maybe all objects are actually subjects as well. Maybe there's some subjectivity involved, not just in plants, but maybe in everything. That's called panpsychism,
right?
And I happen to be a panpsychist, and there's a growing number of philosophers who actually hold that view. So it's a view that's taken more and more seriously academically as well.
And I've been reading that literature. It's fascinating. I mean, this is the idea that consciousness it does exist outside of us in some form, and it's like gravity or electromagnetism. It's a force in nature. I don't know if it's a force, but it's a property. And it's certainly an idea that psychedelic experience is sympathetic to, just kind of at the level of phenomenology. It feels more right after psychedelic experience. So I just think all these interesting questions of consciousness are broached by the experience, and that there's so much that we can learn. I mean, we really have just scratched the surface. I think there's things we can learn about the brain and mental illness. I think there are things we can learn about consciousness. And I just think that there's several rich veins to be explored.
Yeah, it's... the last chapter in your book is called something like In Defense of Neurodiversity, isn't it? And
I don't remember, but that sounds right.
Something like that. Now, Greta Thunberg, the Swedish activist...
In praise of neurodiversity.
In praise of neurodiversity. Yeah. Greta Thunberg, she accredits at least some of her success to her being on the autism spectrum.
Yeah.
And there's an increasing awareness of the fact that neurodiversity, as it's called, can actually be valuable. That some mental states, some ways of functioning are good in some contexts, while some might be good in other contexts. There might be benefits to having altered mental states, different mental states. Do you think we should view psychedelic experiences as something like, temporary neurodiversity, and that we could inherit some of the thinking from the neurodiversity movement onto psychedelics and see this as a mental state, an induced mental state that can actually enable us to see things to which we are otherwise blind?
Yeah, I'd buy that. I mean, I think there's a lot of truth in that. I mean, when I was thinking of neurodiversity, I was thinking of the individual having a variety of mental states, and that we don't, we have this idea. Well, you've written about this. He's written a wonderful paper about this idea of, is psychedelic knowledge the product of distortion? And the assumptions in that. It sounds right? It's a distortion of reality, but our everyday normal consciousness, of course, is very much a created thing we're learning, that there's not a window pane here that we're taking in reality. We're constructing reality through predictive coding and other mental functions. And there are times when forgive me for summarizing your argument, but tell me if I've got it wrong. There are times when the insights in psychedelic experience, you could argue, are more faithful to reality than your everyday normal consciousness. And so that's probably a mistake to say this is distorted and this is real. It's richer than that. Sometimes, I mean, think about this idea of interconnectedness, right? This very common experience on psychedelics that you feel deeply interconnected with other species and other people, and this unitive consciousness, versus your everyday normal consciousness where you feel like a very separate being, encased in the skin, independent, self-reliant. But the interconnected view is more true. You are utterly dependent on everything from the species that you depend on to eat to the 10 trillion bacteria in your gut. The illusion is that you're independent. And that's the everyday normal consciousness. So I think we have to have a more nuanced understanding of what's normal consciousness and realize that there's a benefit in having several different kinds of consciousness perhaps for different purposes.
Because reality is actually pretty trippy. It's a pretty intense psychedelic trip just to live, to think of the bacteria, to think of everything happening in our bodies. It's very strange that all of this complicated mess should just be this very simple ego that looks out from behind our eyes, the soul view that some people at least seem still to hold.
It's comforting and it's simple, and we need to think that one version of this reality is true to just get through the day. But in the same way that the molecules in the psychedelics create a world or a series of worlds, there are other molecules who are creating a world even now as we sit here. That is very much the result of construction and prediction, rather than a simple taking in of sensory information. So, reality is pretty trippy. I think we can agree.
Should we soon open up for questions from the audience, or 5 more minutes? Okay, good.
The questions are being sorted. Are you on your Slido? Have you sent in some questions? I hope so.
Okay. So my hypothesis about this, about how people view psychedelics, is that people who haven't really discovered their own minds properly, they just think that they see a reality just as it is. It's called naive realism in philosophy, and that's not meant to be a derogatory term. It's just called naive realism, and people call themselves naive realists as well. So if you just think that you see the world as if through this just very thin lens, where nothing is added, nothing is subtracted, nothing is given any, your mind doesn't add anything, it just gives you the world. If you believe that this is how the mind works, then doing things with this glass can only create distortions. But if you believe that our minds are more like a thick and curved lens, like, this funhouse mirror that just emphasizes some things and, de-emphasizes other things, then if this is how we view the world, it makes a lot more sense how you can actually learn something new from doing things with a lens.
Right.
So my own, at least, hypothesis is that the more people are inclined towards naive realism, the more they will be inclined to reject psychedelics. But whereas the more they are inclined to reject naive realism, the more inclined they are to embrace psychedelics. Do you think that's right? Is that research we should pursue?
I think psychedelics calls attention to the lens.
Yeah.
Which most of us are not aware of the lens. The fact that this is a view of reality that is good for some things, good for a lot of things, but it isn't the only one. And of course, we have experiences of other kinds of consciousness all the time. They're just kind of subtle. I mean, and we have dreams. Those aren't subtle at all. And for some reason, we just kind of put this in a little box every night and, put them aside. But one way to understand a system is to shake it up. And suddenly you see how it works. And I think that's one of the things. I think psychedelics pose questions about your everyday normal realism. And I was always asking the researchers, say around predictive coding, the theory that we don't simply perceive reality, but we make guesses all the time. And there's a certain pattern of darkness and light and a shape, and we know that's a face. And we don't have to take in all the information to guess a face. And I actually did this very interesting experiment during one of my psychedelic trips, which in fact explains that computer world. which is that there's a famous experiment called the rotating mask experiment that's used in psychology, and it's a concave mask of a face, and it's on a pedestal or in kind of computer space, and it rotates, and you see it when it's convex. And then it turns to reveal the back. You can go online and just search, rotating mask experiment. And as you start to see the back and the hollowness of it, within a half a second, it pops out and becomes convex again. Because the mind refuses to see a face as concave, because it never has. It's been looking at faces since you were on your mother's breast, and they're always convex. And so the mind is trained only to see that. So that's inaccurate. You're looking at something concave. So anyway, I thought I'd heard from a researcher in Germany that people who are tripping, it doesn't pop out. They actually can see the back of the mask. And it's true of schizophrenics, too. That's well established. So I thought, I got to bring this to my trip. And I had queued it all up on my computer, and I was going to press the button and watch it when I was in the midst of this. And it was, according to Mary, that's what created Computer World. It wasn't that piece of music, or it was in conjunction that I was looking at computer imagery, and it just kind of infected everything. And I did it once, and nothing happened. It was just the same. And then at the height of the experience, I said, I got to do it again. Good scientist, take off my thing. I pressed the button. It starts turning, and the whole thing just melted. So I can't report. I can't report back on this. But I hope someone does this, one of these researchers. I'm trying to get them to try this. Because that would be a case, if true, and this German researcher says he's done it and seen it. It hasn't been published. But that would suggest that by defeating predictive coding, the psychedelic is creating a more faithful depiction of reality. And that will scramble our thinking.
That would be an interesting finding.
Yes.
Just a final question from me before we open up the questions from the floor. It's probably now 2 years since you finished writing the book. Have you come, what have your reflections been over the last 2 years? Have you come up with any thoughts about psychedelics that you weren't able to include in the book? Have you?
I've continued to think about it a lot. I don't think my thinking has changed that much in the interim. I went a few years without having another psychedelic experience because I was just being super careful and didn't want to jeopardize any guides. And, if they were legal now, though, I don't feel I've learned everything I can from them. I feel like I started a process. I have a lot far to go if I want to keep exploring my mind and the mind this way. If they were legal, I think it'd be really great to do it every year on your birthday. I think it would just be a good way to take stock of things. Where are you in life? What are your goals? Reflect on your relationships. One thing that people don't talk about nearly enough about psychedelic experience is that we tend to focus on the fireworks and the peak of the experience and these amazing and terrifying things that happen. But many hours of the experience are kind of this denouement, this period after the peak, where you're in a meditative state that I find very, very rich. You can direct your mind. You're no longer being seized by whatever is coming up. And you can focus on things. You can think about the question of consciousness, and you will have a degree of focus that is remarkable. And you can block out everything you want to block out. And so I found that really interesting and worth exploration. I think there's parts of the phenomenology that we haven't written about yet. One of the things about psychedelic accounts is that they're never naive. They're always, the only naive accounts really were the very early ones. Albert Hofmann, the creator of LSD. But Aldous Huxley, The Doors of Perception, which is a beautiful account of that I learned a lot from, of a mescaline trip. He shaped everybody who came after, at least in our culture. And he gave a very Eastern mystical tint to it. And I think we're a little bit trapped in that. And then Leary, too. It was very Eastern. It was Tibetan Book of the Dead. And there's still, I think, other ways to conceive it, just as there are other ways to represent it in film. And I think we have to, we also need great artists to work on this too. So I sort of feel like my account too was indebted to certain people I'd already read. It's inevitable when you're writing, but breaking free of that is also productive too. So I don't know if that I'll write about another psychedelic experience again, but I sure want to have some more.
On that note, we have some
questions.
for the question.